3:30. Dr. William Lane Craig, all yours.
Thank you, David. Well, as you can see from our class schedule here, we are way behind, and there's no way we're going to catch up even today. So tempted as I am to begin by allowing more discussion of what we talked about yesterday, I think we just have to press on and turn to the fifth chapter on Is Genesis 1 to 11 Mytho-History. And what I argue in this chapter is that the presence of the genealogies in the primeval history shows that the author does have an interest in history, that this is not pure myth. Now, I open by issuing a corrective of the careless statements that these Toledot formulae structure the book of Genesis. On the contrary, the book of Genesis falls into three large sections: the primeval history, the patriarchal narratives, and the story of Joseph and his family. And then those are broken into subsections according to literary units. What the Toledot formulae do is to provide a chronology for these primeval narratives. I like Gordon Wenham's comparison of the genealogies to the backbone of Genesis 1 to 11. The spine of a vertebrate doesn't provide structure to the whole animal. That animal could have flippers, legs, arms, no appendages at all. And yet the backbone does provide a sort of structure from beginning to end. And in the same way, the genealogies help to structure the primeval narratives chronologically into a primeval history. But it's not mere chronology. I point out on pages 136 and 7 that even the Enuma Elish contains chronologically arranged stories. What makes Genesis 1 to 11 different is that these genealogies that are the backbone of the narratives move seamlessly into the historical period of the patriarchs, where the historical interest is obvious and is not in dispute. So that just as Abraham is presented as a historical person who actually lived, so his ancestors are presented as historical persons. Now, that shows that there is an interest in genuine history in these narratives. But the relationship between the genealogies and historical interest is not quite as straightforward as might appear at first. And here I go into a lengthy discussion of Robert Wilson's work on ancient genealogies and show a number of factors that suggest that these genealogies are not to be interpreted overly literalistically. For example, you see the chart on page 145, where you've got this artificially symmetrical structure of 10 antediluvian ancestors and then 10 post-diluvian ancestors leading up to Abraham. Moreover, I quote T.H. Green pointing out that the author doesn't ever sum up the ages of the persons involved to estimate the overall time span. And that's in contrast to the Sumerian king lists, which does provide totals and subtotals of these antediluvian and post-diluvian reigns. I also suggest that we should not interpret these literally in view of the long ages attributed to the lives, particularly the antediluvians. I explain how this leads to all sorts of strange coordinations. and that no one really understands what is intended by these long ages of the antediluvians. You see a chart on page 147 of an attempt to try to interpret them as being computed from sexagesimal numbers that were used by Babylonian science. And I suggest that this is just totally concocted and implausible. So I think we have reason then to say that while the genealogies evince a historical interest, they're not just relating straightforward history. On the bottom of 151, I quote Matthews, who says that in general, the theological purpose of these genealogies is to show the interconnectedness of all mankind and the hope of universal blessing. And that seems to me to be the most plausible account of the genealogies that I've encountered in the literature. Their intent is to show the interconnectedness of all mankind and the hope of God's universal blessing. Now, on the basis then of comparative studies of Sumerian literature, the eminent Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobsen proposed that we recognize a unique genre of literature that he dubbed mytho-history. And I want to read the lengthy quotation from Jacobsen on page 152 concerning the so-called Eridu Genesis. He says, these three parts are in both traditions combined simply by arranging them along a line in time, and not according to the more usual device for connecting separate tales or myths, which is grouping them around a single hero. In the Eridu Genesis, moreover, the progression is clearly a logical one of cause and effect. The wretched state of natural man touches the motherly heart of Nintur, who has him improve his lot by settling down in cities and building temples, and she gives him a king to lead and organize. As this chain of cause and effect leads from nature to civilization, so following such chain carries from the early cities and kings over into the story of the flood. The well-organized irrigation works carried out by the cities under the leadership of their kings lead to a greatly increased food supply, and that in turn makes man multiply on the earth. The volume of noise these people make keeps Enlil from sleeping and makes him decide to get peace and quiet by sending the flood. Now, says Jacobsen, this arrangement along a line of time as cause and effect is striking, for it is very much the way a historian arranges his data. And since the data here are mythological, we may assign both traditions to a new and separate genre as mytho-historical accounts. I then call into question whether Jacobsen's condition for qualifying as even quasi-historical in nature is adequate, namely arranging causally connected events in chronological order. As I point out, even in the Enuma Elish, Marduk's conquest of Tiamat most certainly is chronologically ordered and causally connected with his ascendancy to the kingship over the gods. But what Jacobsen is talking about is an ordering in real time, not merely the fictional time of a myth or fable. The second part of the Eridu Genesis is modeled on the Sumerian king list, and Jacobsen credits the inclusion of this section in the tale to, quote, pure historical interest on the part of its composer, end quote. The interest in genuine chronology sets the stories apart from pure myth. Quote, this interest in numbers is very curious, for it is characteristics of myths and folk tales that they are not interested with time at all. No, interest in numbers of years belongs elsewhere. to the style of chronicles and historiography. In Mesopotamia, we find it first in date lists, lists of reigns, and in the king list, later on in the chronicles. But to find this chronological list form combined as it is here with simple mythological narrative is truly unique. The assignment of the tale to a mytho-historical genre is thus further confirmed. Now, while the genealogies of Genesis thus evince an interest in history on the part of the Pentateuchal author and his audience, it is important to keep in mind that it's a mytho-history that is being narrated. Chronological calculations become inappropriate for such a genre. Kenneth Kitchen observes that in the ancient Near East, people were already aware that the world was extremely old. For example, the Sumerian king list indicates that kings had reigned in Sumer for 241,200 years prior to the flood. According to the Babylonian priest Berossus, kings had reigned in Babylon for 432,000 years prior to the flood. And in the footnote, you see, I point out that this would place the first Babylonian kings in the middle of the Pleistocene epoch before the emergence of modern Homo sapiens. So, as I say, the ancient world was already aware of the antiquity of man and of the world. But the biblical genealogies, by contrast, famously total to a scant 1,656 years from Abraham to the flood, with another 367 years from the flood to the call of Abraham. Genesis presents a mythological history of the world that is extremely tiny by ancient standards, bound together tightly by father-son genealogical notices that seem to contemplate no gaps of tens of thousands of years in between them. So we shouldn't imagine that these genealogies contemplate the enormous gaps that would be necessary in order to bring them into harmony with what we know about the history of mankind. But neither should we think of them as purely fictitious characters. Rather, we can avoid these polar opposites by taking the brief history that they narrate to be a mytho-history that is not meant to be taken literally. I then go on to point out how Jacobson's classification of the genre of Genesis 1 to 11 is actually widely supported among evangelical scholars. But they are afraid of the term myth because of its connotations in popular language. And so they use euphemisms to express the same thing. For example, Gordon Wenham, while acknowledging the appropriateness of Jacobson's nomenclature, mytho-history, prefers instead the term proto-history to characterize Genesis 1 to 11. John Collins refers to worldview history. John Walton calls it imagistic history. I've learned since writing the book that no less an inerrantist than J.I. Packer referred to it as archetypal history. Bill Arnold is one of the evangelical Old Testament scholars who is bolder and has used Jacobson's term mytho-history as a classification for the genre of Genesis 1 to 11. And it was from Bill Arnold at the Creation Project conferences at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School that I first heard this terminology. So I conclude on page 157 that although Wenham is doubtless correct that the classification of Genesis 1 to 11 as mytho-history is prone to misunderstanding, I do not think that we should revert to vague euphemisms that tend to conceal rather than elucidate the literary character of Genesis 1 to 11. Scholars simply need to be careful to explain our meaning to laymen. So I feel rather strongly that we owe it to our lay people to be straight up with them and to say what we mean and mean what we say, and to define and use our terms clearly. And so for that reason, I have not shied from this controversial classification of mytho-history. Well, let me ask if there is any discussion then of chapter 6 and this classification of Genesis 1 to 11.
No questions have been put into chat, but if somebody would like to volunteer.
Okay. While someone types one in, let me just make a offhand comment. One of the huge advantages of my approach to the historical Adam is that it provides a unified explanation of the entire primeval history. Almost all other readers just focus in on the narratives of Adam and Eve in Genesis 2 to 3, and they ignore the wider context of the primeval history and its role as a prefix to the book of Genesis and the role of Genesis in the Pentateuch as a whole. But by considering Adam and Eve contextually as I do, I am able to provide a unified explanation for Adam and Eve that comprises not only Adam and Eve, but also the creation story, the fall, the flood, the Tower of Babel, and other parts of the primeval history. And so I take this to be a real advantage of this approach.
Okay. Robert, all yours. Robert. Well, he has it all typed out here. I suppose.
Can you read it?
I suppose. The light bulb went on late last night by way of analogy with parables. No one is upset if the characters and the events in a parable are made up. They are there to teach, usually, a single truth. You don't press the details like an afterlife conversation between a rich man and Abraham across a chasm. Genesis 1 through 11 as myth is analogous to a series of parables woven together to teach several truths, with one other concept doubly supported. 1, the genealogies lend credence to the historicity of the main characters, and 2, other Old Testament, New Testament references strengthen that historicity and also lend limited support to some of the speech behaviors events. If I can go out on a limb with a rough analogy, for 21st century mankind, gleaning truth in a myth is like middle knowledge. If the events had occurred as described, knowing the nature of the characters, you can see that the behaviors are plausible. Scripture is all about the character of the characters, God in his three persons, humans, various fully spiritual beings.
Yeah, I would not go so far as the latter part about middle knowledge. I think it is more than just about the character of the characters. I think these concern historical events that these characters were involved in. And I would be careful about pressing the analogy between the primeval narratives and parables. I would say the parables are closer to folk tales myself. Remember that folklorists distinguish between myths, legends, and folk tales. And the parables resemble folk tales more because they evince no etiological interest at all. And they're not set in a primeval age or another realm. So think again of those characteristics of myth that we talked about in chapter 2 and how that is so different from parable and different from folk tale. But I think that what Robert is getting at is he's seeing correctly that non-literal literary forms can convey important theological truths to us that we need to learn from and can be authoritative for our lives. And we learn this not only from parables, but also, for example, from poetry in the Psalms. where these anthropomorphic descriptions of God all have a literary purpose. I think I mentioned that when the psalmist says that the eye of the Lord is upon the righteous and his ear is open to their prayer, these anthropomorphic descriptions serve a clear literary purpose of teaching that God is attentive to and provident over the lives and needs of his people, whom he loves. The other example I like to give is the final book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, which belongs to the genre of Jewish apocalyptic. And I don't know of anybody who thinks that the book of Revelation should be read literally, that there are going to be multi-headed monsters crawl up out of the sea, and there's going to be a beast that sort of looks like Beauty and the Beast, who's going to be rallying the nations and opposing Israel. These are symbols for nations and alliances of nations and so forth. And so clearly there can be literary forms that are not to be read literalistically, but nevertheless have literal truths to teach us.
Okay, very good. So the next question is from Dan.
Hi, Dr. Craig. Question about the genealogies. Understand what you're saying about, you know, no one has any idea where these numbers come from, and there doesn't seem to be any pattern, and they're all a little bit kind of all over the place and a bit weird. My question is, where do you think these genealogies come from? Because if I'm understanding right, we're sort of maybe thinking that this was penned. Was actually written down maybe sometime in the Kingdom period, or the early Kingdom period. Where do you think this even comes from? So all of these names like Methuselah.
Yeah. Well, I
is this an oral tradition, or?
Yes, that's what I would say. I don't think they're made up. I don't think that the Pentateuchal author just wrote these things. The Pentateuchal author is heir to perhaps literary sources, but certainly oral tradition that he then combines into his primeval history. And I mean, theologically speaking, as I said, I think yesterday, I think ultimately this literature is inspired by God and therefore under his superintendence. But the origins of it are lost in the gray mists of antiquity.
Yes, I wonder if that just adds to the tentativeness in which we try and ascribe meaning to the numbers, or the how literal those genealogies are, if they are being transmitted through oral tradition over long periods of time.
Perhaps it certainly means that we are way out of touch with what it meant to the people among whom they originated. This is a strange new world. And so it's hard for us to know. I mean, I don't know any commentator on Genesis who is confident about what in the world is meant by the longevity of these antediluvians.
Great, thank you.
All right, Daniel.
Hi, Dr. Craig. I was wondering if you had considered using a different term besides mytho-history that could have been just as appropriate or accurate, but wouldn't make people quite as squeamish with the word myth. And I kind of think maybe there's a little history of you doing this with maybe like a term like Kalam has a Muslim origin, which was well received, but maybe a term like Neo-Apollinarianism, which... Yeah,
I kind of have a tendency to pick these bold terms, don't I? But that's a reflection of my wanting to be honest with my readers. Go ahead.
Oh, no, yeah, I was just going to ask. I thought about that.
I was never tempted to use another term because I'd never heard a good term for this. The closest that I had ever heard was, as a young man, I read J.I. Packer on some of these narratives, and he referred to it as dramatic history, that it was like a play where it's dramatized. And I could understand what he was saying by that. It wasn't to be interpreted literalistically. It was a drama based on events that actually happened. But the problem was that's not technically a literary category. And so when I heard Bill Arnold lecture on mythohistory and Jacobson's use of the term, man, it was like the light went on for me. I thought, this is the term that I'm looking for. And so I co-opted it enthusiastically.
Okay. Ted.
Dr. Craig, you had some reservations regarding Jacobson's classification of mythohistory being determined simply by a timeline that includes cause and effect.
Yeah.
And you said there was a portion that you thought was important, though, and I just missed some of that. And I'm wondering if you can recap it, or even a page number might be sufficient.
Oh, all right. Let me just turn back. It would be 152 to 153. And what I pointed out there was, I think if we interpret Jacobson sympathetically, he's not saying that the story simply has a chronological narrative of causally connected events, because lots of myths have that. Obviously, Marduk slays Tiamat before he creates the sky out of her body, not the other way around. But I think what Jacobson is saying is that these are located in real time, the real history of the past, and that's what makes it different. And the example he gives is of these king lists and lists of reigns, which were thought to be actual kings in the past, and some of them have been verified archaeologically as being genuine Sumerian and Babylonian kings. Okay, one more question.
There are two more if you want to take them both. It's up to you. One is Marcus.
Okay.
All right, thank you. So my question was that in understanding now Genesis 1 through 11 as mythohistory, how would you see that impacting our understanding of the relationship between science and religion? So it sounds like that the sort of focus on solely on those theological truths would seem to sort of lend support to Stephen Jay Gould's idea of non-overlapping magisteria.
We'll get into this a lot more in the second half of the book.
Okay.
And I hope you've noticed that at no point have I tried to draw in modern science to guide our interpretation of Genesis 1 to 11. This whole study so far has been based on a hermeneutical analysis of the literary types involved. And I think what this means is that it leaves us able to follow the scientific evidence where it leads. Given that this is a mythohistory, I don't think we can calculate when the world began to exist based on this tiny little mythohistory. Instead, I think we need to turn to modern science to tell us when the world began to exist and when mankind began to exist on this planet. And so it is with this genre analysis in mind that in the second half of the book, I feel free then to turn to what modern science has to teach us about the date of human origins.
Right, but as far as sort of the overlap between science and sort of claims of science,
I do think they overlap. I don't agree with Gould in that respect. I think that there are certain claims, particularly historical claims, that Christianity makes that we should affirm. And I would say, for example, Genesis' teaching of the beginning of the universe and creation by God is something that should be affirmed.
Right, thank you.
One more if you want it, Fred.
Hi. So with regards to the fall, I'm assuming you want to affirm a historical fall.
Yes.
Okay, so obviously this is more speculative, but I'm curious. So we have Adam, and then we have Abraham, and obviously the genealogy is not. We can't deduce years out of there, but it would just imply that because they're both historical figures, there's a large gap of time between them.
Yes.
So say like an event like the fall, how would you conceive of it? Would it be like a series of events, or would it just be like a, you know, like a 1 day thing, or?
Uh-huh. I would say that it did involve Adam and Eve, that it wasn't something later. It seems to me that we should take the fact that our human parents fell into sin and that thereby sin came into the world literally and at face value. And I say that not simply on the basis of Genesis, but also on the basis of what Paul teaches in Romans 5 that we'll see later. I think that Paul definitely understood this to be a historical event involving Adam through which sin came into the world.
Thank you.
Okay, let's take a break now for 5 minutes and then we'll resume with chapter 6.
Okay, it's 4:05.
All right, let's turn to chapter 6, in which we ask the crucial question, are myths believed to be true? And I point out that the question is ambiguous. Figurative discourse can be true, even though it's literally false. For example, if I say it's raining cats and dogs, that statement can be true even if there are not animals falling from the sky. Figurative discourse may be literally false, but nevertheless may be true. Similarly, with regard to myths, the question is, granted that myths are taken to be true, does this mean that they are regarded as literally true? And I quote Alan Dundas, who is expert folklorist on page 159. He says, to the extent that myths are part of organized religion, they are usually believed to be true, even if only metaphorically or symbolically so. So he says, myth may constitute the highest form of truth, albeit in metaphorical guise. And then I go into a discussion of an article by Raffaele Pettazzoni, which is much discussed, on how myths are understood. And I suggest that myths may be taken to be true and authoritative without being literally interpreted. And I give this wonderful example on page 161 from William Doty, who gives a creation myth of the Chukchi people of northeastern Siberia. Let me just read this story to you. The self-created raven and his wife live together where there are no humans, nor any other living creature. The wife says to Raven that he should try to create the earth. When he protests that he cannot create the earth, she says that she will try to create companions for them. She falls to sleep and her black feathers become human, and her talons turn into fingers. Her abdomen enlarges, and before she awakes from sleep, she has created 3 human children. Raven says, there, you have created humans. Now I shall go and try to create the earth. He flies away and asks all the benevolent beings, such as the dawn, midday, and sunset, for advice, but no one gives it. At last, he comes to the place where the sky meets the horizon and sees a tent full of men. Raven learns that they have been created from the dust, resulting from the friction of the sky meeting the ground. They are to multiply and become the first seed of all the peoples of the earth. They ask Raven to create the earth for them, and he agrees to try. As he flies, he defecates, and every piece of excrement falls on water and grows quickly and becomes land. Then he begins to urinate, and where a drop falls, it becomes a lake, and where a jet falls, it becomes a river. Then he defecates a very hard substance, which becomes the mountains and hills. When the men complain that they need food, Raven flies off and finds many kinds of trees. He takes his hatchet and begins to chop, throwing the chips into the water, which carries them into the sea. The various kinds of wood chips become walruses, seals, whales, polar bears, reindeer, every kind of sea and land creature. He says, now you have food. But the men still could not multiply, for there were no women yet. However, a spider woman comes and gives birth to 4 daughters, who grow fast and become women. One of the men takes one woman as a companion. The next day, Raven goes to visit them and finds them sleeping separately in opposite corners of the room. Realizing that they will not multiply, Raven calls a woman to him and treats her to sexual intercourse, which she finds quite pleasant. So she soon teaches the man how to multiply. And that is why girls understand earlier than boys how to copulate. Now, the attribution of both human and avian features and activities to Raven, I think, require that this myth was not taken literally. Gods and goddesses are frequently represented in myths as animals, and we'll see that ancient Near Eastern myths as well exhibit this kind of metaphoricalness. So myths are characterized by this kind of metaphorical or figurative language. And then I draw attention to two other factors that we talked about earlier, namely the plasticity and flexibility of myth. Plasticity has to do with the degree of synchronic variability of a myth. That is to say, different versions of the same myth are legitimate when they are shared at the same time. Flexibility has to do with the degree of diachronic variability. That is to say, they are flexible over time to change to meet changing circumstances. Raymond Firth, an anthropologist, gives an example demonstrating both the plasticity and flexibility of myths from the Polynesian people of Tikopia in the Solomon Islands. And I love this example. It's such a hoot. The example concerns two versions of a remarkably flexible myth about the building of the heavenly Raro-Furoki temple, a sacred Tikopian site. The actual temple was built around the year 1700 and was supposed to have been modeled on the heavenly temple built by God. In the contemporary myth, God calls upon men to pass up to him iron nails to build the temple, but they refuse, passing up only coconut husks and cord. In one version of the story, God calls on men to pass up to him iron nails to build the temple. Oh, I'm sorry. In one version, that's right. In one version of the story, he calls on the men to pass up to him iron nails to build the temple, but they refuse, passing up only the coconut husks and cord. But in that version of the story, God, disgusted with them, departs with the iron nails to the land of the white men, leaving the Tikopians to make do with their inferior construction materials. In the other version of the myth, the model temple is actually being built in England, and God calls down to the workers in English for the nails. Failing to understand English, the Tikopians keep handing up coconut materials until God, in disgust, banishes them to the island of Tikopia, keeping the iron nails in the land of the white men. Now, Firth reflects that the story is clearly an etiological myth designed to explain why the Tikopians have the inferior construction materials that they do. But here's the interesting part. Knowledge of iron implements did not come to Tikopia before 1800. Thus, this feature of the story of the temple building must have been a later adaptation of the original myth. And we see therein not only the flexibility of the original myth, but also the permitted variability in its telling. Either version, despite their different locations and explanations, is acceptable in Tikopian society. And then I give some other examples of plastic and flexible myths. And the plasticity and flexibility of myths, I think, support the notion that what's at stake in believing a myth is not belief in its literal truth. The different versions of the myth that are believed by the contemporaneous members of the society may be even logically incompatible with each other, but nonetheless, there is a fundamental religious truth that is communicated by the various versions of the myth, so that it doesn't matter which version one relates. One doesn't bother to correct someone telling a different version of the myth, for it too expresses the same fundamental truth. If myths were interpreted literalistically, they could not be changed in response to new challenges in ways that would be incompatible with the earlier version. But if both versions continue to express the same fundamental truth, they can both be regarded as absolutely true despite their differences. Now, that is an appeal to ethnological contemporary evidence. But when you look at the ancient Near Eastern myths, I think you will find the same use of figurative language, plasticity, and flexibility that is evident in the anthropological data. So first I talk about the metaphoricalness of ancient Near Eastern myths. And we encounter here, with respect to ancient Mesopotamian myths, a fundamental interpretive dispute between two giants of ancient Assyriology, namely Samuel Kramer and Thorkild Jakobsen. They offered two very different interpretations of ancient Near Eastern myths. According to Kramer's view, the myths are literally about the gods. There are these humanoid deities that populate the world and are responsible for the forces and phenomena of nature. So on Kramer's view, if you were doing an ontological inventory of everything that exists, you would have to include these gods among them. By contrast, on Jakobsen's view, the deities are merely symbols of the forces and processes of nature. So, for example, the Egyptian god Re is just a symbol for the sun. It's really a myth about the sun, not about this humanoid deity. And there are deities associated with all of these different phenomena and forces of nature, such as salt and water and wind and so forth. And that's what these myths are really about. Now, what I point out is that without presuming to adjudicate this debate between these two eminent Assyriologists, it's evident that on neither interpretation are myths to be taken literally. With respect to the symbolic interpretation, this is obvious. There really are no deities. There are just forces of nature which are symbolized by deities. So that interpretation clearly doesn't take the myths literally. But even on Kramer's view, which says that the gods and goddesses are real, nevertheless, as he says, these are invisible realities that cannot be perceived by the five senses. And so the poets and storytellers invent all sorts of anthropomorphic and animal-like descriptions of these gods and goddesses, which are often mutually inconsistent and not to be taken literally. So on either account, myths are figurative and metaphorical, not literal. Now, I consider them specifically Mesopotamian myths. On page 173, for example, the story of Marduk's creation of the world in the Enuma Elish. The classicist F.M. Cornford once exclaimed, "No one but a lunatic under the influence of hashish could ever arrive at the theory that the earth and the sky were originally formed by splitting the body of a dragon in half." And certainly no ancient Babylonian looking up at the sky expected to see the desiccated flesh and bones of Tiamat overhead. Nor did he expect to see the Tigris and the Euphrates emerging out of Tiamat's eye sockets. These are figurative images, not to be taken literally. Another great example is from the Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of the Bull of Heaven, which is the constellation Taurus. In tablet 6 of the epic, the Bull of Heaven comes down to earth and is rampaging through the Sumerian city of Uruk, and is then grabbed by the tail by Gilgamesh and Enkidu and killed and butchered, and then his meat is distributed to the people of Uruk. Now, obviously, this wasn't interpreted literally. If it were, then the Bull of Heaven should no longer be seen shining serenely in the night sky as it is. Similarly, I point out in Egyptian mythology, the sky could be described as the goddess Nut, arched over the earth with her hands and feet touching the ground. And no Egyptian looking at the sky expected to see the body of a naked woman over him, nor did any caravan, I think we can hazard to say, ever think that they might come upon Nut's giant legs and arms resting on the earth and reaching skyward. And then I give other examples of how the gods and goddesses in Egypt are often interpreted or portrayed metaphorically or figuratively. Then on 174, unfortunately, many Old Testament scholars, even those emphasizing the importance of ancient Near Eastern studies as an interpretive backdrop to Genesis, have been seriously misled by wooden literalism with respect to Mesopotamian and Egyptian myths. To give one example, Dennis Lamoureux writes, quote, people in the ancient Near East, now listen to this quotation, people in the ancient Near East believed that the earth was a circular island surrounded by a circumferential sea. Circumferential sea, surrounded by a circumferential sea. The ancient geographical idea of a sea encompassing a circular earth appears in a map of the entire world drawn by the Babylonians around 600 BC. Ancient Near Eastern people believed that the earth literally came to an end at the shore of the circumferential sea. Now, while Lamoureux is not an Old Testament scholar, John Walton is, and Walton similarly claims that the so-called Babylonian world map and Egyptian sarcophagi confirm that all ancient Near Eastern cultures considered the earth to be a flat disk floating on the underground waters and ringed by the cosmic sea. On this basis, it is argued that the biblical authors similarly believed that the earth is a flat disk that comes to an end at the surrounding ocean. Now, this is a terrible misunderstanding of the Babylonian world map, which is pictured on page 175, which you can see for yourself in the British Museum. Now, consider what this ancient tablet actually looks like. What do the triangles on the other side of the circumferential ocean represent? The cuneiform text on the reverse side of the tablet identifies them as 8 regions and speaks of traveling to them. They are lands beyond the sea, places like Dilmun or Bahrain, Megan, the Persian Gulf coast, including Oman, and Meluha, or the Indus Valley, with which Babylon engaged in trade. Between and beyond these regions lies uncharted territory. The closing section of the text explains that the earth's surface extends limitlessly to the north, south, east, and west of Babylon. So, to say that the map represents the earth as a flat disk in the midst of a surrounding ocean is a gross misunderstanding. In fact, I call into question whether this diagram really is a world map at all. It carries no such inscription. Countries like Egypt, with which Babylon was familiar, don't even appear on it. If it's a map at all, it's highly stylized map of Mesopotamia with Babylon near the center, of course. Overseas countries lie in the identified regions or in the uncharted territory, which is limitless. The circular shape of the ocean shouldn't be taken literally, because Babylonian seafarers knew that one could not travel by ship from the Persian Gulf, what they called the Lower Sea, to the Mediterranean Sea, the Upper Sea. And the further claim then that the world geography of a disc-shaped earth surrounded by water is in the biblical text, I think, is just unfounded. And given Israel's familiarity with overseas nations, see Genesis 10, the table of nations, including seafaring nations and Mediterranean islands listed in the table of nations, is wholly implausible. In fact, as I mentioned yesterday, according to 1 Kings 9, 26 to 28 and 10:22, Solomon actually had a fleet of ocean-going merchant ships that sailed out of the port of Ezion-Geber on the Gulf of Aqaba and plied the waters of the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean so that they would have been familiar with overseas territories. Perhaps, though, the most egregious example of unwanted literalism with respect to ancient Near Eastern materials is the claim that, according to the so-called cosmic geography of the ancient Near East, the sky or the heavens are a solid dome over the earth resting on its horizon on which the stars are engraved. And what I point out is that this is a presumptuous literalism that has no justification at all. This becomes especially evident since the ancient Mesopotamians were expert in charting the motions of the stars. It was all about plotting when the stars would be where, during what seasons, and when they would return to the same positions in the sky. But that is incompatible with the idea that there is a dome in which the stars are engraved resting on the earth at its horizon. You'd need to have a system of concentric spheres to explain the motion of the stars, such as you do later have in Greek cosmology, but this is unattested in Babylonian astronomy. And then I go on page 179 into an examination of Babylonian astronomical texts called the Astrolabs. And these are illustrated on page 180. And what you see is that they divided the sky into 3 bands named for 3 different gods. There was the northern band of the sky, which is the path of Enlil. There's the southern band of the sky, which is the path of Ea. And then there is the path of Anu, which is the equatorial band of the sky. And they would plot the motion of the stars across the sky along these bands. Now, what is significant is that they were well aware of the planetary motion of the 7 planets visible with the naked eye, as well as the moon and the stars, and that the planetary motion didn't follow the same pattern. The planets would be observed to move to a certain position, stop, and then actually reverse and have retrograde motion. And so when they plotted the motion, for example, of the sun here, you can see in the chart that the sun actually goes across the path of Anu into the path of Enlil, crosses Anu again, and goes into the path of Ea. This is completely impossible given the idea of a hard surface on which these stellar and heavenly bodies are engraved. And I quote then from Francesca Rochberg, who is a philosopher of science for ancient Babylon. And she points out that the Babylonians were not interested in having physical cosmological models at all. She said they were only interested in plotting and predicting these stellar positions, but they had no interest in constructing a physical cosmology. And one of the confirming evidences of this is that they used two incompatible systems that are known as System A and System B for plotting the motion of the stars. And the difficulty is that both of these couldn't be true. They were both empirically, instrumentally adequate, but interpreted literally, they would be incompatible with each other. So these mythical texts that portray the sky as a dome or a surface or levels of stone, I think are clearly to be understood metaphorically and figuratively and not literally, for this would have been incompatible with what ancient Babylonians believed. As for Egyptians, I point out that the same thing is true of the Egyptians. And I give an analysis there of this icon of Nut arched over the surface of the earth, and a description of how the sun enters her mouth at night in the west and then is birthed between her thighs in the east in the morning, and the clearly metaphorical and figurative sort of language in which the sky is described. Moreover, on page 187, I point out that like the Mesopotamians, the ancient Egyptians also observed the motion of the stars and planets. As early as the Middle Kingdom, an astronomical system was in place, according to which the so-called heliacal stars, that is to say, the stars that are last ones to be seen prior to dawn, rise over the horizon at 10-day intervals. In the pictures on the coffin lids dating from 1800 to 1200 BC, we find the sky represented with 36 constellations arranged in their 10-day intervals throughout the year, forming 36 columns with 12 lines each for the 12 hours of the night, in effect, a star clock. The sun also moves through Nut's body. But here's the funny part. The Egyptians observed that the sun has a slow motion of its own relative to the stars in the opposite direction of the daily rotation of the stars. This eastward direction, eastward relative motion of the sun, completed once every year, delays the rising of the sun from day to day with respect to the rising of the last stars visible at dawn. As a result, the rising of those stars will become more and more clearly visible, and it will take more and more time before the last stars fade away in the light of dawn. Other stars will replace them as the last stars of the night to be visible. And it is this sequence of phenomena that led the Egyptians to measure the time of the night by means of stars that we now call the decans. For 10 days, a star indicated the last hour of the night, and then another star was chosen for the next 10 days, and so on the assumption that a year had exactly 360 days, or 36 decades. Then 36 decans would be required before a given star can once again serve as the decan of the last hour of the night. So they clearly understood that these stars were in motion and that the sun was in motion relative to the stars. And all of this is incompatible with the idea that the stars were fixed in some kind of a dome resting on the earth at the horizons. And I then go and look at what the Bible has to say about the firmament or the rakia, and I suggest exactly the same thing, that there's no reason whatsoever to interpret this in a literalistic way. So honestly, brothers and sisters, I think that it's just indisputable that these ancient Near Eastern myths were understood as filled with figurative and metaphorical language, symbolic language, and were not to be interpreted with a sort of wooden literalism. Now, on 191, I then talk about the plasticity and flexibility of ancient Near Eastern myths. We've talked about their figurative nature. What about their plasticity and flexibility? And here again, I point out that you also have the same flexibility and plasticity observed in these ancient Near Eastern myths. For example, the evolution of the Gilgamesh epic over years. And then the syncretism that characterizes Egyptian religion that I talk about on page 193 and following. Egypt has just become famous for the plasticity and flexibility of its myths. On page 194, I quote John Wilson, who epitomizes Egyptian mythology by saying the Egyptians accepted various myths and discarded none of them. So over the course of 2,300 years, there emerged this fundamental myth of origins, which could then be expressed variously in these different cult centers that we talked about on the first day of class. And I talk about then the different variations of how these developed, the syncretism that characterized Egyptian mythology, where the gods and goddesses would become merged into one thing, like Atum Re or Khnum Re or Sobek Re or Montu Re at different localities. And thereby they become a kind of new unit formed of distinct deities. And then the iconography of Egypt permits an astonishingly rich variety of possibilities of representation of a deity. On 196, I point out that the goddess Hathor, for example, can be depicted as a woman, as a cow, as a woman with a cow's head, and as a cow's head with a human face. In addition, she's represented as a lioness, a snake, a hippopotamus, and a tree nymph. And moreover, these are not successive. At any period of time, the goddess could be depicted in all of these ways simultaneously. And we shouldn't think that the Egyptian thought that Hathor actually had, for example, a human body and a cow's head. Rather, these images were meant to express different facets of her character. As Eric Hornung says, the maternal tenderness of a cow, but also the wildness of a lion, the unpredictability of a snake. These images were, as it were, pictorial or visual metaphors. I point out on 197 that if you take Egyptian mythology literally, it is a mare's nest of logical contradictions and metaphysical absurdities. But if you take it metaphorically and figuratively, then it just isn't a problem. And then finally in this chapter, I apply this to Genesis 1 to 11, where I suggest that many of these stories similarly ought to be taken in a figurative way. I finally closed the chapter then by saying, if these stories are often figurative, then what are the central truths that are meant to be taught by these stories in the primeval narratives? And those are listed on page 202. Let me just read them. 1, God is one, a personal, transcendent creator of all physical reality, perfectly good and worthy of worship. 2, God has designed the physical world and is the ultimate source of its structure and life forms. 3, man is the pinnacle of the physical creation, a personal, if finite, agent like God, and therefore uniquely capable of all Earth's creatures of knowing God. 4, mankind is gendered, man and woman being of equal value, with marriage given to mankind for procreation and mutuality, the wife being a helper to her husband. 5, work is good, a sacred assignment by God to mankind to steward the earth and its creatures. 6, human exploration and discovery of the workings of nature are a natural outgrowth of man's capacities, rather than divine bestowals without human initiative or effort. 7, mankind is to set apart one day per week as sacred and for refreshment from work. 8, man and woman alike have freely chosen to disobey God, suffering alienation from God and spiritual death as their just desert, condemned to a life of hardship and suffering during this mortal existence. 9, human sin is agglomerative and self-destructive, resulting in God's just judgment. And 10, despite human rebellion against God, God's original purpose to bless all mankind remains intact as he graciously finds a way to work his will despite human defiance. And I think these are just a few of the fundamental truths that are taught by the primeval history of Genesis 1 to 11. Any discussion then of that chapter on whether or not myths are believed to be true?
Yes, first, Steve.
Yeah, Dr. Craig, I was wondering if you would agree overall that the stories in Genesis, as you argue, the mytho-historical narratives in Genesis seem maybe a little more mundane and ordinary, a little less fantastic than some of these other stories.
Oh, yeah.
I've been listening. This is a very foreign territory for me, and it's been very interesting. I cannot believe some of the things I've read about some of how these old myths and how they characterize how the world was made. It's been very interesting. Some of the things you've been talking about, and the God holding. I think there's one you read from your book where there's the God holding up the arch of the sky and hanging over the world, and bodies of gods that were and bodies.
When I first saw that, I have to say, when I first saw these Egyptian iconography of Nut, I was shocked because they portray her naked with her breasts hanging down, over the earth. And I thought, boy, Egyptians must have gotten a load of that if they really thought that was what you'd see when you looked up. It's so clearly figurative and metaphorical. But yeah, absolutely. Genesis 1 to 11 is so modest by comparison. I've identified fantastic elements in Genesis 1 to 11, but I mean, it's nothing like the myth of Raven and his wife, or some of these Mesopotamian and Egyptian myths, which are absolutely wild.
And just to follow up real quick, and the two things I take from that is, number one, maybe an unfortunate practical thing is it's hard for modern readers, including somebody like me, to buy in, although I think you're making a strong case to buy into the mythical element, because you could kind of go, well, they seem a little bit more historical, but they're not as clear cut. If only, we had stories about the Raven and everything, I think everybody would agree, of course. But these seem more mundane. And the second,
well, now remember that I'm emphasizing this is not pure myth.
That's right.
It's mytho-history.
Right.
These are real people and events, but
Right,
they're
right.
cloaked with this figurative language. So you're
And
right.
I just wondered if, and maybe you just answered the second part, is the reason for that, maybe the reason for the more ordinary nature have something to do with the Israel's worldview,
Yes.
that, God is transcendent, the world
Yes.
makes sense, that man is
Yes.
rational, that,
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that this desacralization of nature that we spoke of before is pivotal here and fundamental. When you've got a desacralized nature, you're not going to have a lot of these fantastic stories of gods and goddesses, either behind or in or as the forces and phenomena of nature. It leads to a much more scientific view of the world. And again, this is what astonishes me. I mean, when I think that this desacralization of nature is generally credited to the early Ionian Greek philosophers around 500 BC or so, if these narratives are prior to 1000 BC, as seems likely, these oral traditions of Israel, how in the world did they come up with this stuff compared to all of their surrounding cultures and background? It just blows me away. And so I think you're absolutely right that the achievement of Israel here is astonishing, and it makes a world of difference in the Hebrew creation myths and so forth.
All right. Next, we have Ben.
In regards to the two Babylonian astronomical models that are incompatible with each other, and in general, this idea that inconsistencies in ancient belief indicate they didn't actually believe them, I wonder if this is applicable to modern scientific ideas like the wave-particle duality of light, or quantum mechanics and relativity that have inconsistencies. And I know that if you asked a modern physicist, do you not believe the wave-particle duality of light? Do you not believe in relativity and quantum mechanics? They would say, no, we believe them, but we just admit our ignorance. We don't have a unifying theory yet, but we expect to resolve these apparent inconsistencies later on. They don't believe they're really inconsistent. They just don't have a unifying theory yet.
Yeah. Well, I think, Ben, that they do believe that the current theories are inconsistent with each other. Everyone recognizes that contemporary physics is built on the twin pillars of general relativity and quantum physics, and that these are irreconcilable with each other in the current theory. So I think that anti-realism about these, which is the same thing really that we're talking about, would be a prominent feature among reflective philosophers of science and reflective physicists. That do you remember the distinction I gave earlier about the difference between acceptance and belief? I think a lot of them would say, well, we accept general relativity, we accept quantum mechanics, but we may not actually believe it in the sense that we're not realists. This is just the best working model that we've got. But whether or not this model is really a literal depiction of the way the world is, I think that reflective physicists and philosophers of science would be very reluctant to say that these literally depict the way the world is. And so I do think this is quite analogous to these ancient instrumentalist views of the cosmos or cosmic geography.
Okay. Cool. All right, Dan.
So my question is just about how we understand ancient Near Eastern cosmology and their picture of the universe. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts around Sheol. And how that fits into the picture, because I came across a bit of a weird verse in Numbers, where Numbers 16:31, where the ground opens up and it swallows people down, and it says they went alive down into Sheol, which makes it sound a lot like there's this literal place beneath the earth that the ground split and they fall down into
Right.
it and then it closes up over them. I don't know if that features in, or if you've got any thoughts around that.
This relates to what I was saying about the three-decker cosmos, where
Yeah.
heaven is up there. Certainly, they did talk about heaven and God looking down from heaven. Or in the Tower of Babel story, God says, let us go down and see what this tower is they're building. So there's certainly these descriptions in the Bible, into the New Testament as well, with this sort of three-decker cosmos. But whether or not this was taken literally by everybody, I think is anybody's guess. Perhaps some people did take it literally in that way, but I don't think that we can know that that's the case. If they did, I would say that it represents a presupposition and not a teaching of Scripture, that they didn't teach a three-decker cosmos, even if they presupposed it. And I would say something similar for geocentrism. I imagine the biblical authors naturally believed that the sun goes around the earth, that was their sort of unreflective view. But I don't think that the Bible teaches geocentrism. So I do think there's a valid distinction to be made between what they presupposed and what they taught. But having said that, I would not say that they did presuppose that the sky was this dome over the earth. In that case, I feel very confident that those descriptions of the sky, the heavens, the firmament are figurative and metaphorical on the basis of the evidence that I've adduced from the primary sources.
Great, thank you.
All right, 3 more. Hunter.
Like Steve, I'm appreciative of the way you've articulated.
I'm not hearing him, Dave.
Hunter, adjust your audio.
Sorry, I was muted. Like Steve, I'm very appreciative of the way you've articulated this view. It's been very helpful. So my question is very straightforward. What scholarly arguments have you heard opposed to the mytho-historical view of Genesis 1 through 11 since your work has been published? What do you find is the stumbling block for people on an academic level?
I have not heard any scholarly critique offered yet. I've heard other models for Adam proposed. For example, Josh Swamidas has a book called The Genealogical Adam and Eve, which came out before mine did. And he proposes this model according to which Adam and Eve were a relatively recent special creation of God in the garden, but outside the garden, there was a vast human population of thousands of people, so that Adam and Eve are not the universal progenitors of mankind. And I mentioned earlier in our discussion 3 reasons why I reject that interpretation. But although Josh and I have each defended our different respective models, I haven't seen any critique yet of this view. On the contrary, as I say, it's a view actually that's widely shared under different names. Now, there will be a panel discussion at the Evangelical Theological Society meeting in November in Dallas, Fort Worth, in which the book will be responded to by a panel of biblical scholars and scientists. And I'll be looking forward to that with a great deal of interest.
Okay, thank you. I'll be looking forward to that.
Bill.
Mine was more of just a comment. I just wanted to say that, like, one of the things that I'd never really given much thought to was the education that Moses might have received. You know, and how that might have played into his authorship in the Pentateuch. And you know, it really, for me, this is such a reconciliation, and maybe this is usable, and you tell me what you think of this, Dr. Craig, but it's a really good, like, meet in the middle kind of argument that seems to really indicate that, yes, the Genesis account is, even if it is a, purely myth, it is far superlative. After you read the Myths from Mesopotamia book, it's far superlative to all the rest of them. There's no doubt that the Holy Spirit had his hand in this. Even
not to mention how vile these pagan myths are. The immorality, disgusting.
I told my wife after reading the Epic of Gilgamesh, she said,
Yeah.
I'm going to say 50 Shades of Gilgamesh. That could be one. But anyway, yeah, I thought that was an encouraging thought. I might use that in a conversation when I talk about these things. And another point of encouragement for me, it's been this week I started 2 classes, your class and a class with the Oxford Institute of Islamic Studies, where I'm actually dialoguing about Adam and Eve all over the world. Like, that's our first 2 assignments. And this has been, I've been able to reference your book a few times. It's been pretty neat for them to hear that perspective too.
Huh.
And so
very good. I had a question of the week on our Reasonable Faith website a month or so ago, responding to a Muslim about these questions of Adam and Eve and the creation story and whether or not it would be mytho-historical. And I was actually sharing with him that since the Quran is committed to all of these same stories, that what I'm saying as a Christian could actually be of real service to him as a Muslim. Now, with respect to Moses, just let me say that conservatives who believe in the historicity of the Exodus and believe that Israel spent a few hundred years in slavery in Egypt often do like to try to draw these comparisons between Egyptian mythology and Genesis 1 to try to show that the Hebrew stories are reacting against the Egyptian stories. But I've already offered my criticism of that. I just don't see it, that when you understand Egyptian mythology, that it's this sort of monism that is just completely unlike what you have in Israel. And motifs like darkness and water are such common motifs in myth that I see no reason to think that these reflect Egyptian influence.
Interesting. All right. Thank you.
Last question, Aaron.
Yeah, I have a slightly more practical question. Given, as you say, that the boundaries around mythical elements and imagery are not always so clear, do you have any advice for pastors, Bible teachers, people like that, who are trying to faithfully teach this, but aren't really sure where exactly those lines are?
Boy, this is a hard question that I've wondered about, and I'm not sure what to say. With respect to discerning elements that are figurative, in my response to the article in First Things, I list 3 criteria that can help us to spot figurative language. One would be when the story contradicts the Pentateuchal author's own beliefs. And the example I give is the anthropomorphic descriptions of God in Genesis 2 and 3. The second one would be when the story flagrantly violates common sense and what was common knowledge at the time. And the examples I give would be having sunset and sunrise prior to the creation of the sun, or that the primordial waters could all drain away in just 24 hours, or that the earth could bring forth fruit trees bearing fruit in 24 hours. And then the last one would be if there are inconsistencies, then that suggests a figurative reading. So those would be 3 criteria that one could use to try to discern figurative elements. But I would agree with what you said at the beginning. I do not think that clear lines of distinction can be drawn. I suspect that mytho-history is more like mixing cream in your coffee than having different colored marbles in a bag.
My instinct is to say when I'm really not sure, and I'm in dialogue with a couple of friends on these issues, and when it comes to these things that I'm not sure about, my instinct is to just say, I don't know what to make of this. I mean,
that's a very honest response. Yeah. Well, let's take a brief break and then come back at 5 after, shall we?
Yes.
The question, too, to continue the discussion here, that I have wondered about, and I don't know the answer to this, is if this proposal is correct, how do you share these stories with children?
Mm.
Is it like telling them there is no Santa Claus? When I don't know the answer to that. I mean, how do you help a child to understand figurative language or stories that teach deep truths but aren't literal? I don't know how to do that.
Can I just say that is such a powerful question for me, with having 2 young kids myself who go to a Christian school and come home and they, talking about Adam and Eve, and it is so difficult to know how to, you don't want to sort of put doubt into their mind that the Bible is true. It's a very difficult. Thank you for raising that. That's a great point, Dr. Craig.
Yeah. When we had little children, we had a diaper changing pad that used to just make my blood run cold, because on this diaper changing pad was a cartoon of Noah and the Ark. And it was this happy ark with happy animals cavorting about it. The giraffe's necks coming out of the window. In the foreground was a blue and a pink hippo cavorting with their big eyes and smiles. And I would look at this thing and I'd say, is this what the flood story is? A child's cartoon, a fantasy? And I just didn't know what to do with it. It really bothered me. And this analysis I've given you in this week has enabled me to come to rest, at least with respect to this sort of concern. But how to share it with children, I have no idea.
Yeah, that's really difficult. And the story of Noah in particular, I have a couple of atheist friends who, when they share their story of walking away from the faith, central to it is always, I grew up and opened the Bible for myself and realized that these stories were not quite as happy as, they were painted through childhood. And that's really
I've often thought, when non-believers go to the Bible and begin to read it, if they begin with the New Testament and the Gospels, they're apt to come to faith. But if they begin with Genesis and the primeval history, they're probably going to say, this is just a bunch of fairy tales.
Yeah, well, and part of my motivation for asking what I did is that I don't want to fall into the other pit of saying, well, I'm not sure what to make of this, and then give off the impression that therefore it's not really that important, so let's forget about it. So that's a difficult balance, I guess.
Yeah, I think you can share honestly with people that you're unsettled, you don't know, you yourself are struggling to understand these. And I have found that people respect that. There's one atheist blogger on the internet who just attacks Christians incessantly. And when he saw how I had struggled with this issue, his attitude so changed. He said, I don't think I've ever felt closer to William Lane Craig than when he was expressing his own deep personal struggles with this issue. And I thought, isn't that interesting? Rather than the confident apologetic arguments, it was the uncertainty and the struggle that he found most appealing.
Dr. Craig, I was hoping to slip in another unrelated question. When I get sick, my wife calls me a merman. I sit in the bath for hours, and believe it or not, I listen to old episodes of the Reasonable Faith podcast, and I was listening to the something around circa 2015, and I was just curious. I think Kevin mentioned that Lee Strobel wanted to write a biography on you, and you mentioned something about getting Jan's permission to do it, and I just wanted to ask to see if that's something in the works or still undetermined.
It is not. I think that Lee abandoned the project when I told him that if this was going to be a biography, it had to be a serious biography of me and not just window dressing for saying, here's the Kalam argument, here's evidence for the resurrection. In other words, really an apologetic book masquerading as a biography. And once I told him that, I never heard anything more about the project.
Dr. Craig, how is your view received in amongst your family members?
Jan has struggled with this as well. You know, I remember very early on we were talking, she said, well, I believe there was a talking snake. And oh, it was like a dagger in my heart. I felt so bad, you know, that I was opposing or destroying this, you know, this sort of innocent belief. But she trusts my scholarship and my work, and we talk about these things. But I really don't try to dissuade people who hold to this literal view. I wouldn't want to do that. What I try to do is to offer what I conceive to be a very plausible alternative so that people who are struggling with these issues, as I was, will have something that, a view that they can adopt and not lose their faith. But our kids, I think, are basically unfamiliar with it. I don't think they've had any interest in looking into it.
Are your kids Christians?
Oh, yes. Yeah, in fact, our son is teaching this very night at Austin Ridge Bible Church in Austin, Texas, on tactics for sharing your faith. And he'll be using some of Greg Kokel's material. So we're really proud of John, and we talked to him on the phone this afternoon, a little bit about what he's going to say and so forth. So yeah, and in charity as well.
Nice, nice.
Yeah. Well, let's resume. We come then to chapter 7, which is devoted to Adam in the New Testament. And I won't read all these biblical passages from the New Testament about Adam, but I do want to turn to page 206 and highlight these critical distinctions. First, the distinction between the literary Adam and the historical Adam, which I think is poorly understood. The literary Adam is a character in a story, specifically the stories of Genesis 2 and 3. The historical Adam is the person, if such there be, who actually lived. The actual individual the stories are about. And then I give this analogy of the Pompey of Plutarch's Lives. That is the literary Pompey, whereas the Roman general who actually lived is the historical Pompey. And what we want to know is how closely the literary Pompey of the Lives descriptively resembles the historical Pompey. And we think it's pretty well, because Plutarch was a good historian. And so similarly, we want to know how closely the literary Adam of Genesis 2 and 3 descriptively resembles the historical Adam, or more precisely, whether New Testament authors assert that the literary Adam of Genesis 2 and 3 closely resembles the historical Adam. Now, this implies a further distinction between truth and truth in a story. A statement S is true if and only if S states what is the case. A statement S is true in a story if it is found in or implied by that story. So if I say, for example, that Gilgamesh slew the bull of heaven, my statement, though true in the Epic of Gilgamesh, is false. Truth in a story doesn't imply truth, but it doesn't preclude truth either. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, there are implied statements such as Gilgamesh was an ancient Sumerian king that are both true in the epic as well as true. So the relevant question for us is whether the New Testament passages about Adam and Eve are intended to assert truths or merely truths in the stories of Genesis. Now, with that distinction in hand, we have a further distinction between a New Testament authors using a text illustratively and using a text assertorically. Using a text illustratively is using the text merely to provide an illustration, real or imagined, of the point the author is trying to assert. Such an illustrative use of a text does not commit the user to the truth of the text itself, but merely to truth in a text. For example, Greek mythology is frequently a source of illustrations for us. We speak of something's being a Trojan horse, or somebody's having an Achilles heel, or of someone opening a Pandora's box, without thinking that we're thereby committing ourselves to the reality of the relevant mythical entities. Now, New Testament authors not infrequently appeal to pseudepigraphal and mythological stories to illustrate biblical truths. And it's difficult to know when an author is using a story assertorically rather than merely illustratively. And then I give an example of a text where it's difficult to understand which is which. Now, on page 209, I then say that the illustrative use of a text occasions a further distinction, the distinction between what a person citing a text believes and what that person is asserting. Perhaps someone using the illustration of the Trojan horse believes that such an instrument actually existed and turned the tide of the Trojan War. But right or wrong, his personal belief is irrelevant to the point that he's trying to assert or teach when he says that something is a Trojan horse. Thus, a text is used assertorically, as I'm using the term, if and only if the user means to teach the truth of the text, not merely truth in a text. Now, I say at the bottom of 209, these distinctions are not drawn in order to weasel out of commitments on the part of New Testament authors to the truth of the Genesis story. Rather, I think they are important in our treatment of many New Testament passages, which, if interpreted assertorically, would be unfounded in the Old Testament and sometimes plausibly false. And intriguingly, as I just mentioned, some of these passages involve the citation of pseudepigraphal and mythological texts to whose truth we should not wish to be committed. These texts seem to be used illustratively by New Testament authors, just as we use illustrations drawn from Greco-Roman mythology without thinking to commit ourselves thereby to their historicity. And so this next section is just critical, and I'm going to be so interested to hear the response of New Testament scholars to what I say here in discussing New Testament authors' use of extra-biblical literary figures. And I give a number of illustrations, but let us go immediately to one of the most interesting on page 215, and that is Jude's use of the story of the archangel Michael in his dispute with the devil over Moses's body in Jude verses 9 and 10. And this tradition might also have been known to the author of 2 Peter in 2 Peter 2, 10, and 11. Now, there is no such story to be found in the Old Testament. According to the church father Origen, the story is to be found in the apocryphal book, The Assumption of Moses. And I quote him, "In the book of Genesis, the serpent is described as having seduced Eve, regarding whom in the work entitled The Ascension of Moses, a little treatise of which the apostle Jude makes mention in his epistle, the archangel Michael, when disputing with the devil regarding the body of Moses, says that the serpent, being inspired by the devil, was the cause of Adam and Eve's transgressions." Unfortunately, the extant version of this treatise, which is known to us only from a single incomplete 6th century manuscript, doesn't include the story of Michael's dispute with the devil over the body of Moses. Richard Bauckham believes nonetheless, and I quote, that although the source of Jude's story of the dispute over the body of Moses is not extant, a wealth of material is available from early Christian sources from which it should be possible to reconstruct the story which Jude knew. Bauckham discerns two versions of the story in Christian tradition. In one version, Satan attempts to preclude Michael's burying Moses' body on the grounds that Moses had once murdered a man. But Michael vanquishes Satan and buries Moses anyway. In another version, Satan claims to have suzerainty over the material world and hence Moses' corpse. But Michael retorts that God is the creator of all things. Bauckham considers the latter version to be a later development reflecting the contest with Gnostic dualism. He says it's hard to believe that a Palestinian work of the early 1st century AD would have included the kind of refutation of dualism which the texts quote from The Assumption of Moses. This version of the dispute over Moses' body, Bauckham says, much more plausibly reflects Christian anti-Gnostic arguments in the 2nd century after Christ. Noting that the ancient lists of apocryphal books mention both a testament of Moses and the assumption of Moses, Bauckham hypothesizes that the earlier Palestinian testament of Moses was subsequently rewritten and entitled The Assumption of Moses. The revision that transformed the Testament of Moses into the Assumption of Moses may have been almost entirely confined to the concluding part of the work. And so on the basis of these Christian traditions, Bauckham reconstructs the version of the story that he thinks was known to Jude. And it goes like this. God sent the archangel Michael to remove the body of Moses to another place and bury it there. But Samael, the devil, opposed him, disputing Moses' right to honorable burial. The devil brought against Moses a charge of murder because he smote the Egyptian and hid his body in the sand. But this accusation was no better than slander against Moses. And Michael, not tolerating the slander, said to the devil, "May the Lord rebuke you, devil." At that, the devil took flight, and Michael removed the body to the place commanded by God, where he buried it with his own hands, and thus no one saw the burial of Moses. Now, however we reconstruct this story and its evolution in Christian tradition, what is clear here is that Jude is citing extra-biblical Jewish legends about the burial of Moses to illustrate his point about false teachers. And so I think we have here an illustrative reference to the literary Moses of the Testament or Assumption of Moses, and therefore are not committed to the historicity of this dispute between Michael and the devil over the body of Moses. Another example is Jude's citation from 1st Enoch. Incredibly, Jude actually cites 1 Enoch 1:9 as though it were from the Enoch of the antediluvian primeval history. And I say on page 217, this text is the reductio ad absurdum of facile arguments for Old Testament authorship and historicity on the basis of New Testament citations. Jude's quoting a pseudepigraphal figure no more commits him to the authenticity and historicity of one Enoch than our quoting a myth commits us to its authenticity and historicity. And then I interact a little bit with Guy Waters on this text. Another fascinating example on page 218 is Jannes and Jambres in 2 Timothy 3:8, the magicians that opposed Moses. These two personages do not appear in the Old Testament, but they are widely known in Jewish folklore as the unnamed magicians in Pharaoh's court who opposed Moses. They became known even in Greek literature as famous sorcerers, as we see from Pliny's Natural History and other references. The New Testament reference most clearly resembles the account given in the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, which I will not cite. Now, in his commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, Origen says, the statement, as Jannes and Jambres withstood Moses, is not based on canonical books, but on an apocryphal one entitled Jannes and Jambres. Intriguingly, Origen reports that some of his contemporaries rejected 2 Timothy as a whole because it borrows from one of these secret books. Fragments of this work in Ethiopic, Coptic, and Greek exist. The traditions behind this work may have been known in the Qumran, Dead Sea Scroll community, for the Damascus document among the Dead Sea Scrolls mentions the pair. Moses and Aaron still continued in their charge, even though Belial in his cunning had set up Jannes, Johanna, and his brother in opposition to them. Albert Pietersma argues that the traditions concerning Jannes and Jambres go back to at least 2 BC in Jewish internecine struggles under Hasmonean rule in Palestine, while the book was written during the darkest period of Egyptian Jewry under Roman rule around the turn of the era or shortly thereafter. I note that a bewildering variety of contradictory traditions concerning Jannes and Jambres grew up in Judaism. In the traditions employing the pair's Hebrew names, which are presumably more primitive, no magician's contest with Moses takes place. Rather, they quarrel with Moses, accompany Pharaoh's army in pursuit of the Israelites, magically fly about at the Red Sea, and are killed either by God or Moses. By contrast, in the traditions featuring their Greek names retranscribed into Hebrew, we find that the pair serve at Pharaoh's court, lose to Moses in a magician's contest, convert as a result to Judaism, and they go into the wilderness with the Israelites. Koji Osawa comments on the function of Jannes and Jambres in Jewish tradition. They came to be seen as the exemplars of evil persons in Judaism, so that their names came to be used in a variety of scenes without restriction by time or place. That is to say, those who recorded the Judaic traditions included Jannes and Jambres in stories from whatever time to portray someone as an evil person in Judaism by comparing that someone with Jannes and Jambres, and thus to emphasize the sinfulness of those who oppose God. And we should therefore, I think, be rash to assume that in appealing to these well-known figures to illustrate corrupt religion, the author of 2 Timothy means to assert the historicity of these two literary characters. Finally, my last example is Paul's allusion in 1 Corinthians 10:4 to the rock that accompanied the ancient Israelites in their wilderness wandering, which Paul identifies with Christ. Now, commentators typically see here a reference to a Jewish legend based on Numbers 21 concerning a miraculous well shaped like a rock that continually supplied Israel with water in the desert. This legend, which flourished in later rabbinic Judaism, is documented as early as the 1st century biblical antiquities of Pseudo-Philo. The tradition in some form doubtless goes back to the pre-Christian era. Paul picks up this extra canonical tradition in order to identify the rock in the story as Christ, who sustained Israel through its sojourn in the wilderness, just as elsewhere he can say, Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. Now, on the basis of these examples, I think we can see how naive it is to argue that just because a New Testament author refers to a literary figure, whether found in the Old Testament or outside the Old Testament, that therefore that figure is asserted to be a historical person, much less is a historical person. We need to pay careful attention to the context in order to discern whether the New Testament author does not merely believe in the historicity of the person referred to, but is actually asserting his historicity, rather than referring to the figure merely illustratively. Again, use of a literary figure illustratively does not imply that the figure is unhistorical. It simply short circuits overly easy proofs of historicity. Any question about that treatment of these pseudepigraphal and mythological citations in the New Testament?
Well, there were 2 questions that were outstanding. Do you want to take
Oh,
those?
is there anyone on this subject? Because I would like to get that, if that's
Well,
okay.
no.
Go ahead.
Okay, so Leonard, let's go with yours.
Sure. I do think mine is a bit on topic. My question is kind of a comprehension one again. Would you say the Hall of Faith in Hebrews 11 is an example of using texts as rhetorically or illustratively?
I am not sure. I have struggled with that. This host of witnesses, are these merely referring to the literary figures of the Old Testament or the actual historical persons? Let me say this, insofar as the author thinks that this cloud of witnesses actually exists in the afterlife, that would commit him to talking about their historical reality and not just the literary figures involved. So it's going to depend on how you interpret that about the cloud of witnesses.
Thank you.
Dan, do you want to throw yours in from earlier?
Yeah, sure. This was just really around the genre of mytho-history. And I appreciate that Genesis 1 to 11 squarely, what you're saying squarely fits into that genre, and other parts of Genesis and the Pentateuch or even the Old Testament aren't part of that. They belong to different genres. But my question is, are there sort of principles or styles in the way that mytho-history is written that we could perhaps see elsewhere in the Old Testament in more historical genres? So for example, thinking about something like the Exodus, where you have all these fantastic stories, is it possible that you have a similar sort of thing happening there, or even later in the King Chronicles and that sort of thing?
Yes. Now, Hermann Gunkel's original book was entitled The Legends of Genesis. And he distinguished, as folklorists do, between myths, legends, and folk tales. And I think what you would be asking, and I think this is a legitimate question, is, could these be legends? Could the stories of the Exodus or Balaam's ass or Joshua's long day, could these be legends of the Jews, as Gunkel thought? And that is a quite different topic. that I'm not concerned with and don't discuss. I'm focused on the question of myth and mythohistory. Clearly, those other stories are not myths. They don't have any etiological interest. They're not set in a primeval age. They don't have those family resemblances. And I want to take my stand firmly on those. But that does leave it still an open question as to whether or not these could be legends or folk tales.
Great, thank you.
All right.
I think
it
some
is
of the
5
examples that I've just discussed here in the New Testament, like the dispute of Michael and Satan over the body of Moses, or the well that rolls through the desert with the Israelites applying the water, those would be good examples of Jewish legends and folklore that get illustratively used in the New Testament, but they're not myths.
Okay, so it's 5:30. Thank you, Dr. Craig, as always.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, folks. Discuss amongst yourselves.
Well, unfortunately, gents, I've got to hop off here. I have a class coming up at 6:30, and I've still got to make it to campus in Houston, so I better get there. Appreciate you guys, though.
You
See
too.
you, Bill.
All right, Bill. I'll see you in a few minutes.
Yeah. See you there, Hunter.
And Dave, I'd be interested to know what you're thinking as you're listening.
I was thinking, I hope nobody asks me what I'm thinking. This is so outside.
Sorry.
This is so outside my wheelhouse. I think I'm just going to let you guys discuss for now, and I'll continue to process and maybe tell you later.
I think for me, understanding Craig's differentiation of like these overly easy proofs is, to me, that's been super, super convincing. Like mythohistory stuff, I'm still working through it and processing, but the overly easy proofs, examples that he gives with like Janus and Drambrus and First Enoch just seem to me really powerful. I don't know if anyone else feels that way, where those examples especially seem really strong.
Yeah, I really think that the biggest hurdle is the language of myth and the connotations that are attached to it. I think if you can get past that hurdle, then a lot of the things that he's saying are not that radical.
Aaron, I thought your question about what are the boundaries in interpretation, that's, to me, that's one of the big questions, like going forward, is okay, I feel like I can pick up Revelation and have a pretty good idea of what the boundaries are as far as interpretation. And there are some questions where like I don't really know, but the myths that are referenced, the other things that are like mythohistory, I kind of am like, I don't even know how to interpret this at all. Like the Raven story, the Russian Raven story, it's just like, this is totally crazy. And I don't know how you would get anything out of it. And so I don't really know how to transfer that over into reading Genesis in a way that's positive and helpful.
Yeah, and I think part of the challenge with stories like the Raven story is that people maybe instinctively take a story like that and assume a really broad freedom to just read what they want into it, which obviously is not what we want to do with, scripture. So yeah, that's been a big challenge that I'm trying to think through.
Kind of going back to one of the comments I was making yesterday, I did a bit more reading about the Aboriginal dreaming here in Australia, and it's so hard to understand. It's almost a little bit like Eastern religions as well, like Buddhism and Hinduism. It's I just kind of wonder whether this is just a way of thinking that we've just lost, and so we can't. I don't know. It's very like that Raven story. It's very strange, isn't it? Like it's hard to know what the original heroes were even thinking. Is nodding along, going, "Yes, Raven droppings makes land," or I don't know. Like it's weird.
I do think that like the modern day myth, like the materialist myth, presents an interesting parallel with like especially flexibility, where you've got the warm primordial soup, and then but it doesn't have to be that. It can be a warm ocean vent, or you know, a multiverse is fine, but it could also be you know, some other really exotic materialistic cosmology where there is an idea behind it that's coming through. And for me, it almost makes more sense to think of Genesis in those terms, because I can understand that there's this big idea that's behind that. Where the Raven story, I'm like, I have no idea what the big idea behind this is. I don't really understand what they're trying to communicate.
What did everybody think about the, I think even in the book, I think Craig was pretty honest that we really can't make any conclusions, but I think the question came up on the genealogies, because that seems to be something Craig is saying is really one of the key factors that anchors us more into history as opposed to pure myth. But, you know, you read those genealogies and it seems like, and correct me if I'm wrong, is his position, it seems like his position is that they're referring to historical individuals, but the ages are something we can't take literal. And it just seems weird because they're so specific. Like some of them, don't they get to, you know, they lived a certain amount and had their first son on this year, and then they lived a certain amount and they're very specific. And somebody asked like where they came from, maybe it was you, Dan. And I think that was a good question. And I think that helped me when he said that it wasn't like the Pentateuch author was just making them up, or Moses, whoever it was, wasn't just making them up and let's pick 67, let's pick 342, or, you know, throwing dice. They were probably laid down traditionally somewhere along the line, and the author incorporated them, but you just don't take them literally. It's still a struggle of mine, because the genealogies where I can see a story being mythical, it's hard for me to see names on a list, you know, with a lineal descent pattern as being mythical. I mean, I understand the argument, but it's a little bit harder for me to accept.
I'm going to comment on that as well. So I had heard Dr. Craig say in another spot, I don't know if he emphatically, but the idea was that if anything, it shows a historical interest of the authors to include the genealogies. Whether you press them for literal truth is another question, but it at least shows the historical interest of the authors in those contexts, because you see those genealogies both in the Old and the New Testament. So there's definitely some sort of connection there.
I wonder if, in addition to saying that there's a historical interest, it also identifies it as a myth of some sort, because they would have known that people don't live that long. So I wonder if it's actually could be like a twin, you know, serve a twin purpose there. But as for the specificity, you kind of scratch your head, you know, why, you know, 936.
I tend to think that's where a literal interpretation actually has the edge, because why would they be those specific numbers? Because that's how old they were, you know, or that's how old they believed they were. And so, yeah, so I tend to think that the writer, the original reader, probably did think that these are literal father, son, and that's literally how long they lived. They really lived those ages. That just seems to be the plain obvious reading, and there doesn't seem to be anything else that would suggest that these numbers are symbolic in any way, or hence my question of where on earth they're coming from then. So I tend to think that would kind of make sense.
I start getting twitchy when people use phrases like the plain reading and that sort of thing. I don't want to make myself into Yeah, I don't want to make myself into the Michael Heiser guy because I'm really not that familiar with his work, but I did listen to him at some point on his podcast walk through his view on these ages, and I'm trying to look it up now so that I can link it to you guys. I don't remember exactly what the view is, but he leans toward the idea that the ages have numerical representations that when you put them in that ancient context, they have a sort of meaning. And I'll try to find it so that I can send it to you guys. So it's a lot less vague than that. But I think there are a lot of explanations floating around, and I think that it's about as settled as like the mark of the beast, and attempts to decipher what the number of the beast means. And there's a handful of prominent theories, and everyone basically says, "Here's my pet theory." But it could be a few other things. That's my understanding of where it's at least.
I've always wondered if the ages were literal. Do we understand these as like they were just youthful longer? Because when we think nowadays, when you get to 100, you're not going to be moving around quite well. And so if you're living to be 600, surely you're not in great physical condition. But I think Noah was 600 when he was building the ark, right? And so the youth of these folks, I'm wondering if they are intended to be literal, if the Pentateuchal author was imagining them as just youthful way beyond their primes, or what we would think of their primes, I guess.
Well, I don't know, because in all the pictures I see of Noah, he's got a beard.
So do you.
Youthful beard.
I mean, I think that they had youth because they fathered kids well beyond 100, 150 years. So that there had to be some carryover of youth.
Since there's no other explanation given, I think that they have to be non-literalistic in some sense. I don't know what it is, and Dr. Craig says he doesn't know what it is either. So I think it's just so far outside of our normal, well-known lifespans that it has to be figurative at some level. And I don't know what that level is. I don't pretend to understand every passage in the Bible, absolutely. And this is one of those passages where, I don't understand those numbers, but I don't see how they can be literal. And I am perfectly happy to take them as figurative in some sense. And if somebody could come up with a way of describing what the figurative nature of them means, I'd be real thankful. But it's not going to make me start believing that they actually did live that long. I thought that his little collection of comparisons of all those generations, and how was it Noah that Shem actually outlived Abraham? If you add up the numbers, you got Shem actually outliving Abraham, and that didn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. But there's no further explanation given, so I don't know how literal it's intended to be, and I tend to think not so much literal.
That's a good point. I had never known in all these years, I never made those associations that not even Shem, but was it Noah that would be living 60 years into Abraham?
Yes.
I mean, so Noah's around when Abraham is there, and but there's no righteous on, it just, that almost really convinced me that we're at least reasonable in taking a figurative interpretation.
This coexistence of generations that I never thought of when I was a kid first occurred to me when I watched that movie, Noah. Did you see that movie? That Hollywood version of Noah?
Oh, that movie was interesting.
It was terrible. It was terrible.
Terrible.
However, do you remember that his daughter-in-law went to visit grandfather Methuselah in his cave to ask him what was going on? Do you remember that in the movie? And I thought, what? And now I look at the numbers and I realize Methuselah died the year of the flood. if you add up the numbers. He died the year of the flood. So that movie had a tiny little bit of actual biblical material in it. Other than that, it was just terrible. The other one, Exodus, Gods and Kings, that one I liked. That was pretty good. I liked that. But it was definitely Hollywood. Anyway, so I don't see those lengths, those years, those ages as being literal, but I don't really know how they're to be interpreted. And I'm happy with that.
One of the things that's always been interesting to me too, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but doesn't the Septuagint use different numbers in that time period than the Hebrew version?
Yeah, he mentioned in the book. He mentions that in the book.
That's what I thought. And that's
they
always
were
been...
so bothered by that they adjusted the numbers for
Yeah.
those translations. I didn't look that up, but I take Dr. Craig's word for it. If he says it, I'm pretty sure he researched it.
Mm-hmm.
As far as not taking it literal, I thought he made a good point that there's 10 antediluvian ancestors and then 10 post-diluvian ancestors. I thought that also weighs on the non-literal interpretation side.
Yeah, I think that was a good one, good emphasis. But again, I don't know to me, and I'm going to live with that probably the rest of my life.
Hey, Aaron, or anybody else, I've heard him many times and I've seen him here or there, but is it Michael Heiser? Who is he? Is he at a seminary, an Old Testament professor somewhere? Or?
Yeah, he's a Hebrew scholar, a Semiticist, and he worked for a long time. He was scholar in residence with Logos, the Bible software. And just in the last year or two, he's left there and is now teaching his own courses. They're like non-accredited certificate type courses at a master's sort of level. But he's really a top-notch scholar. Whatever you think of his views, he puts out a lot of content, and it's all really useful.
If you've heard of Tim Mackey and the Bible Project at all, he's a bit of a Heiser fan, I think. So you might hear stuff from Heiser in his podcasts.
Heiser can be an acquired taste though, because he doesn't beat around the bush ever, and he's a scholar through and through. And so, if you ask him a question, he's going to throw journal articles at you and say, if you care, then you'll read these. So that's kind of his approach. But he's very serious about it. So I appreciate that about him.
He's come up with the few ideas that I've chased down. They're very, very unusual. Not what I learned in my Baptist upbringing.
Yeah. I don't know.
A bit of an. I was going to shift the conversation. You go, Aaron.
No, you go. I was going to do the same. So.
Well, I was going to ask maybe an edgy issue, which I kind of raised there. I got to ask there at the end about the idea that, and I think the way Dr. Craig put it was good, was the idea of legends or folk tales being elsewhere in the Old Testament. I am on this journey to try and understand what the Bible is and how it was written in the context of the ancient world and how they wrote history and those sorts of things. And I don't have any really strong views. And I've got to be honest, it's quite difficult. It's difficult spiritually to ask these sorts of questions when you have certain assumptions about the Bible. But there do seem to be some things that are quite weird in the Old Testament that don't really line up with the way that we do things today, or the way that we write history today. And so I'm just wondering if anyone's got any thoughts around that idea that it's not myth, but legend or folktale could be elsewhere in the Old Testament. I feel like it's a dangerous slope.
Yeah. If it's legend or myth, it's not intended in I don't think it's intended to be thought of as true. If it's legend or folktale, I had those crossed up there. If it's myth, there is some aspect, some in which it is true. Something about it is true. The moral of it is true, or the purpose of it is true. But legends are, I think, make-believe stories about people. And folk tales are kind of similar, only they're like more so. No divinities involved. I really appreciate the ability to do these three concepts, legend, myth, and folktale.
Dan, I think you're right that there's a bit of a slippery slope there. When I was in Bible college, we were reading through a lot of Old Testament passages and interacting with people's attempts to explain them. And there are some explanations that lean really far in one direction, like the parting of the Red Sea. People have come up with these complicated explanations of how when such and such wind blows during this season and the waters are low enough and the rock has eroded, right, the water can sort of part, and that might be what happened. And so I think there's definitely a pitfall over there, and it's difficult to navigate this literature that we're so unfamiliar with. And
rather than you got more to say, Aaron? Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I don't know what you're referring to, Dan, as far as, in the rest of the Pentateuch, but I would be pretty uncomfortable going the legend or folk tales route. I would think discovering a different kind of genre like Richard Burridge did with the Gospels, of historical biography, and like this is how they wrote biographies at that time, that would be a better route to go. Is, okay, well, what kind of histories were written around that time, and how did they do that? And it's maybe an issue more of this is the way they wrote history rather than sliding it into the folktale or legend thing. That's kind of my gut, or my
and I guess that's kind of where I'm going. I don't mind the label, and I think the terminology you've got to try and get it right, because you don't want to confuse people. But that's the sort of thing that you might have, I guess, maybe a way to say that these non-literal elements, not factual, not literally historical things throughout the rest of the Old Testament. Anyway, I think it's probably getting a bit further afield than what this is all about, but I just thought I'd put it out there for people's thoughts.
No, I think that is the point of the book. Show things are non-literal, but still useful. And in some sense, still true, non-literal.
I'm kind of curious, actually, unless somebody wants to take it back more to the specific book, what things you're referring to, Dan?
So a couple of things come to mind for me. And look, I have not done huge amounts of research here, so this is more me musing and speculating. But an example would be the story of the Exodus and the conquest of the Promised Land. What I do understand about that is that the consensus of archaeologists and ancient historians is that is not how, like, the portrayal in the Bible is not like how it happened. Or another example might be a bit of a curious one is the end of what happened to King Manasseh in the kingdom period, how you have different, they're not completely contradictory, but they do seem intentional when I read them, at least, how he ended his life. In one he kind of doesn't really say much, but in another he gets taken off to by the Assyrians to Babylon, of all places, where he repents and then gets sent back. That's in Chronicles, I think. And so the suggestion I've heard there is this is kind of a creative retelling of history to make sense in the post-exile period. And I don't know what to do with that. But thinking of Genesis 1 to 11 as belonging to this category of mytho-history just kind of makes me wonder whether I need to be more flexible in the way that I understand the Bible and just kind of let it be what it is in the ancient world, without trying to force it into a modern category, if that makes sense.
Just to comment a little bit more on what Dan brought up, I think the chief problem with Exodus that at least I've seen is that there isn't enough, like if you have a whole bunch of people, like there's this massive amount of Israelites that are traveling from Egypt to the promised land, then they should leave more behind in the record. We should have like their campsites. We should have the record of their travel there, of this literal mass migration of people. And as far as I know, now this is, again, I'm with Dan. I haven't researched this very thoroughly, but the consensus is that there isn't that sort of data out there, which I also kind of relate to you, what you're saying, Dan, because I think Dr. Craig is right that you can't use, like for sure, you can't use the mytho-history solution in other contexts because they're not myths. But I think it is a legitimate question to ask, what other, like, is there another genre that would explain these certain things if we do find that, for example, the Exodus is intention? But I'm like you, I haven't researched it enough, and it's not as interesting to me either. So I don't know on that one, but I know that the main issue is that there's just not enough evidence of like a bunch of people that should have been, should be a bunch of evidence for a bunch of people moving around that isn't there.
Oh, look, I think you just set yourself a PhD thesis subject.
Yeah, and it's not as though I've got a strong view on it. I don't at all. It's just more like I don't have time to read about everything I've got interest in. I just can't stay awake long enough to read the books.
Nobody can.
And so it's kind of like you might be a bit like me in that these questions kind of like burn into you a little bit, and that I hate not having an answer, or at least a thought that allows me to just put it to bed and go, I don't need to worry about it. And so, anyway.
I think putting it to bed is a dream, a pipe dream. I don't think we can get them all put to bed. But I think if you can come up with something that's plausible, and you don't have enough data to prove it, but it's plausible. Like, for instance, why is there no trace of the Israelite horde moving through the desert? And I was just thinking, well, there's a whole lot of caravan trails back and forth across that desert that would have a lot of debris. You wouldn't be able to put out very much of it. And I don't doubt that they would have followed one of those trails as they moved across the desert, one or more. So you would lose their track and all the other tracks that have gone across the desert. I don't know if that's true, but it just seems like a plausible answer. Maybe, could be, I don't know. And it's enough for me to just, okay, then I'm not going to worry about that anymore. I'm not going to put out to research it though, because I'm not out to get a PhD here right now.
I like that approach a lot, Rick, where we can say initially, we may not know for sure what the answer is, but we've got this plausible alternative, and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but for now, that'll work.
Yeah, that's how I see it. I try to do it that way. I really like Dr. Craig because I think that's how he started with this Adam thing, was with a plausible idea, and then he developed it. Now he poured, I mean, should be able to take and get 2 or 3 PhDs with it, in my opinion. So he takes it very seriously and does a very thorough job. But I think that's pretty much how he started it. He had a niggling question in the back of his head and decided, okay, I'm going to tackle that one. Because I don't know if you realize, if you remember, but you probably all know, the book he just published before this, The Atonement, he spent years on that one because that thing was hugely important and terrifically difficult to do. This one only happened in about a year, I think he took to write this one. So yeah, until I get the better idea or worry about it for some reason, I'm just gonna accept my plausible alternative.
There's a book that Craig was asked this question about some of these things, Dan, in one of his question of the weeks, and I can't remember what he said now or anything about some of these Old Testament things. And he recommended a book, and it's been in the footnotes of this book. You may have already known about it and read about it. I can't recommend it. I don't know anything about the guy, but it's one I've been kind of piqued my
Just
interest.
throw it
in.
out there. Just throw
If
it
I
out.
get there, it's I think his name is Kenneth Kitchen.
I've got his book.
Okay, all right. So okay,
But no, I know the one. Yeah, I know the one you're talking about, and it is interesting. It is a pretty good read. Yeah, he's a maximalist, so it's good. Another one. Yeah, I can't remember what it's called. But yeah, I've got that one. Yeah.
All right. I thought by the way you've been speaking, I thought you already be familiar with it. But.
He just Dr. Craig just mentioned that one or that name today somewhere.
Well, listen, folks, I enjoyed listening to you process all of this. You're a smart bunch, and appreciate all your insights. And I'm telling you, some of your voices are awesome. You could be like radio personalities. Not just the guy with the accent, though I love that accent, but a whole bunch of you.
You are the ones with the accent.
I know you always say that. Steve's got a great radio voice. Aaron's got a great radio voice. Leonard, you rock. Rick, I enjoy you. Everyone. Well, you guys have a great day, and get some good rest, and we will see you tomorrow.
All right. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, Dr.
Thanks,
Baggett.
Dr. Baggett.
Well,
Bye, guys.